Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your seats. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Dolores Barclay, and I am the administrative manager of the Ira A. Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights. And I thank all of you for coming out on this miserable night to be here. And I'd like to welcome you to this very thoughtful and extremely critical discussion that we're having tonight and presentation of a wonderful documentary, or at least a clip from it, Under Poison Skies. The BBC documentary reveals the deadly consequences of the toxic air pollution oil companies cause through flare-ups in their oil fields. These flare-ups, which are caused when oil companies decide to burn off gas instead of capturing it, that's natural gas, of course, particularly impacts the health of young children who live nearby or sometimes even on the fields just about. The problem is a universal one. Although the film focuses on the high incidence of cancer and other illnesses in Basra, which is in southern Iraq, oil field flare-ups are also killing Americans living near fields in Texas and elsewhere in the United States and throughout the world. And of course, they poison the environment. To discuss this issue, we are very fortunate to have with us tonight Owen Pinnell, an investigative journalist and filmmaker from the BBC, and Jessica Kelly, an award-winning filmmaker. Their documentary investigates the sacrifice zones in Iraq, where oil companies' profits are prioritized over health, humanity, and the environment. We are also honored to have John Beard, an environmental racial justice advocate from Port Arthur, Texas, who lives in an oil industry sacrifice zone, and Dr. Manuela Orjuela-Grimm from Columbia University Medical Center, who specializes in epidemiology and pediatric oncology. A study Manuela did in 2012 greatly assisted the filmmakers in their research. Leading the discussion after a brief clip of Under Poison Skies, we are privileged to have Professor Nina Berman. Nina is a celebrated photojournalist and a much beloved professor in this school. So thank you for being here, and please help yourselves to the movie snacks in the rear of the room.
So thank you everyone for being here and watching that very important film. We're going to have a conversation and then leave a lot of time for questions because there's a lot to talk about, and it's rare that we have people who are reporting on or living in situations from different parts of the world together at the same table, which is quite extraordinary. So I'd like to start with Jess and Owen. First, the story's been going on for a while. How did you come to it? And how did you get into Iraq to film it?
I'll take that, yeah, and then hand over to Jess.
Or tell us as much you can tell us about that part.
We saw on our kind of Twitter feeds and also people we were speaking to in southern Iraq sharing videos of the phenomenon you see in the film. So, these gigantic flaring stacks giving off black smoke, and obviously it looks incredibly apocalyptic, and we wanted to find out more. So we looked at satellite data, and we saw from satellites that these flares are really visible from space. And if you look at the map, the global map, it's the area of southern Iraq where we filmed has kind of got the I think it's the second highest level of gas flaring in the world after Russia, but it's still it's an enormous amount of gas flaring, and the US in Texas has a similarly high amount, but we wanted to follow the story up in Iraq. So getting in there for filming was a challenge. I should rewind a bit. The thing that really made us want to go was finding out kind of how many cases of cancer there were in the towns and villages that are surrounding these gas flares, because everyone we spoke to was saying that they had a case of cancer in their family, kids getting sick. It was not just cancer, it was other diseases as well, but it was overwhelmingly leukemia that people were talking about. And other than what we could see from satellites, there was very little data and very little in the way of reporting about this. So that was when we kind of took the decision that we should try and make a documentary about it. I don't know, Jess.
And they denied you permission, right? Official permission to film?
Not exactly. I mean, we weren't totally upfront about what we were doing when we went there, but also I think that there must have been some awareness about what we were doing. And there were a few kind of sketchy moments in the early days when people we were working with were threatened and told that they were, jeopardizing millions of dollars for Iraq by talking about this issue, because oil is more than 90% of Iraq's economy. So it's pretty dangerous for people to speak out about it. And that was probably one of the more difficult things. It was to find people who would be happy to be in the film, and without making it unsafe for them. And I think we kind of got the balance right in the end by following families whose children were in this really tragic situation, because I think it's meant that they haven't really been threatened as much as maybe they would if they were just an activist, like a
Right.
anti-oil activist, which there are a lot of people who are very angry about the way things are, but it's so dangerous for them to do the activism like someone like John would do in the US.
And how did you find Dr. Shukri? Am I pronouncing his name right? Yep.
Yeah. Well, he was one of the few scientists that had done a study correlating the increase in barrels per day since 2009, when the big contracts were signed, and cancer cases. So we spoke to a few different scientists. Some of them definitely didn't want to be part of the film, again, because of the risks. And Professor Shukri was just incredibly brave. And we were just so lucky to find him, because he knew the risks and he wanted to do it anyway.
So, there's so many unique things about this film, but one of them is that you're documenting his work, but you're also helping to facilitate it, which I think is maybe something we as journalists can think about more deeply, how we can facilitate research as well as documenting the situation. So can you talk a little bit about how you were able to do that? And did you have to convince your editors that this was an important thing to do?
I suppose. In the beginning it was difficult because there'd been a few reports about this issue, and it's obviously so visible. You can see this flaring. It's pretty obvious that must be having a damaging effect. But there really wasn't any proper science out there or testing, and even the statistics about cancer were quite patchy. So we felt that in order to kind of do this story justice, we needed to add something. We needed to bring some data to the story, and neither of us have a science background, but we started speaking to different types of scientists, air pollution scientists, urine scientists. No, that's not urine. But finding different ways in which we could try to measure pollution, which is, air pollution is notoriously difficult to monitor. And then you're right, it's a quite strange way to go about it for journalists because we sort of came up with the tests based on our conversations with scientists and then proposed it to Professor Shukri, who didn't have that equipment in Iraq. And so we bought the equipment and we knew how to do the tests by then. And it was a collaboration, which it is really unusual. And I think our bosses were at first really skeptical that you could prove what's the cause of cancer or illness.
Mm-hmm.
But we managed to agree that as long as we can show that someone is at a higher risk of getting cancer, then that was the proof that we needed.
And in our earlier discussions, you also were just saying the kind of like the cost and the logistics, and I'm focusing a little bit on like the journalism details here because it is unusual, but it's like very powerful in the sense that you were able to, test the results rather than just going in as journalists documenting someone else's work. So do you think that you would do something like this again if given the opportunity? Like, do you see this as something you're more interested in working on? Because you have situations maybe not as severe as in southern Basra, but you have situations all over the world with oil and gas companies polluting, poisoning, destroying, hurting, and in places that are very under-resourced, right? And so I'm just curious if it's something that you've thought about, or we could also just leave that for later on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a set of tools that we have kind of become aware of as a result of making this film, and I think it's worth kind of highlighting, the sort of team of scientists who were equipping us with those skills and tools to use in Iraq. We had an amazing insight from the Greenpeace Science Unit, who huge advocates for kind of community science, and we also had obviously Manuela and Frank, who's in the film, and others advising us on methodology. I think, as you say, it's relevant in so many places. Just today, I was reading about how Chevron in Mississippi has just been given the go-ahead by the EPA to basically burn plastics to create energy. Yeah. And apparently a lot of those, the chemicals that are being emitted there are not going to be monitored in any way, despite what they say is astronomical cancer risks from these chemicals. So, once again, it's an opportunity for investigative journalists to kind of get in there and use the tools, which are actually quite inexpensive and accessible. Obviously, what we can achieve as journalists is not going to be on the same scale as a peer-reviewed scientific paper, but it might kind of get some data out there in what is otherwise a complete vacuum, and then hopefully lead to more discussion and more research that can hold people accountable, because I think that data vacuum is a real problem for accountability, which is what we're really concerned with as journalists.
Thank you, Manuela. Maybe you want to add a little bit also, like your role in helping to make this film possible through your expertise, and also the relationship between scientists and journalists, and how we can help each other.
First of all, I'm very grateful to be invited to this panel and to this conversation. And I think, in fact, we had a sort of the correlate of this yesterday in the public health school, and in preparing for that, and it was precisely that relationship of the partnership that we don't typically think of either in public health, of collaborating with journalists. And as I thought about it for our students, I thought, really there are so many skills that journalists bring to the table for helping us see situations that we might not otherwise be able to see. So I think in general, to me, this could be a new model for collaborations, and I could see many advantages from it. I also think in this setting, it was quite extraordinary for me. This was a research project I hadn't thought about in years. It had been very important, but sort of my own science had moved away from this, and it was just sort of getting this email, which I could just as easily have ignored.
Email from you?
Yes, yeah, it was from Owen.
Yeah, just an annoying.
Annoying
for some
journalist.
reason, I looked at it. But I think, there are a lot of pressures for academic, soft money investigators, and this is not what we're supposed to be doing. But it was just so incredible. As a collaborator of mine said, wow, it's just so amazing when you realize that something that you worked on academically can make a difference. I mean, there is a public health issue that we started with in northern Manhattan, potentially different sources of pollution, but there is certainly a public health human right angle, but the exposures that the BBC team was working with were extreme, and if you can help, if our work done here can be helpful, it's an incredible honor and opportunity, and how could you not want to do it? So.
I want to go back a little bit before we talk to John for a second. But what was Basra, southern Basra, like? Was it always like this? Or can you tell us a little bit about southern Basra and who lives there?
Yeah, I mean, it has always had a quite big oil industry. Before the invasion, it was nationalized.
Mm-hmm.
So none of the big companies were working there for a certain period. Obviously, prior to that, you had the Anglo-Persian oil company who did some of the first drilling. So they've always lived with oil extraction, but it's really since 2009 that the drilling has massively increased. So from 2009, it was around 1 million barrels a day, and today it's more like 4 million. And so I think that, when you fly into Basra from the sky, it's just lit up with flares. Even when you're landing, you've got flares either side of the runway. It's really feels apocalyptic. And anywhere you drive, like not in the very center of the city, but outside, there are flares everywhere. And they're not these kind of really tall flares where the smoke is way above. They're often low to the ground. There's black smoke coming off them. They seem really unregulated. And it tends to be poorer communities who live right next to the oil fields. And in the case of Rumaila, which is the massive oil field where BP is the lead contractor, a lot of the people who live there because they used to live in the marshes, and when the marshes were drained, they left, and Rumaila was a cheap place to live. Mm-hmm. And that's a pattern that has happened across that Basra Governorate region, where it's mostly lower income communities who are living with this really toxic pollution all around them. And yeah, I think everyone is aware of the issue and everyone is angry about it, but there's a total kind of lack of response from the government because they're desperate to keep production up and they're desperate to keep the Western oil companies in Iraq.
Mm-hmm. You touch upon this in a little tiny bit in the larger film, the U.S. invasion occupation of Iraq, which we're coming on the 20th anniversary, and it's kind of crazy to think that a lot of the students in the room were just little children at that time, so maybe don't have this idea of the Iraq War in their head. But you know, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists who covered that war, and they're gone. And that usually happens, is that they go in with the troops, and then when the troops leave, then they leave with the troops. And so in many ways, this is also a story about the aftermath of war, which has been tremendously uncovered. And so is it fair to say that the U.S. invasion occupation enabled this in some way, or helped this to happen? Would you have had all these multinational oil companies in the same intensity as you do now, or can you just talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would definitely have been completely impossible to have those Western companies come in and take on big contracts without the war. Obviously, yeah, I mean, as you say, it's coming up to 20 years, so it's less obvious actually now to think about what the official narrative was of that war at the time, which was about weapons of mass destruction.
Right,
which,
mushroom clouds.
Right,
Yes.
we were imminently...
Mythologies. And
right,
yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, Saddam was a dangerous dictator, and so he needed to be taken out. But actually, you know, a large part of the motive for war, it's kind of emerged since, seems very clearly to be to do with Iraq's vast oil reserves, and some of the kind of documents that have come out since have really borne that out. So Chevron, which was Dick Cheney's company, who was George W. Bush's vice president, his company Halliburton got a $7 billion contract in Iraq to rebuild Iraqi oil fields, and that was with no competitors for that contract at all, no bidding. It was the biggest oil contract ever awarded, and I think overall all of those contracts were the largest bonanza of oil contracts ever the oil industry has ever seen. So, I mean, it definitely was massively, you know, enabling for those oil companies, and you know, similarly on the British side, you had high-level meetings between Shell and BP, because you know they wanted to get a slice of the action too. So
Right.
yeah, it's
The
definitely-
coalition forces.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Always by the US's side. So,
Right.
yeah.
John, in some ways, your town of Port Arthur, Texas, and southern Basra share similarities. They're both in many ways colonized places, you could say, and where the health and well-being of the residents is sacrificed for the fossil fuel industry. And so you've been living this story and fighting these companies for, I imagine, most of your life, or a large part of your life. A long time. Can you tell us a little bit about Port Arthur, Texas, for those who haven't been there and don't know about it, and the people you know there, your neighbors, and the people that have suffered under the oil extraction business?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to say, as others have, thank you for having me here this evening to talk about this and bring a little bit of Texas to you, as well as Southeast Texas, where I'm from. And the best way I can tell you, if you're not familiar with it, but hopefully not geographically challenged, is that when you look at where Texas and Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico meet, that's Port Arthur. That's where we are, on the Gulf Coast. And a lot of people think that Port Arthur is basically about oil and gas and all that, and that's only part of the story. Port Arthur's history really began with rail and steel, when its founder, Arthur Stilwell, who was a New York financier, by the way, wanted to have a port or terminus on the Gulf of Mexico so he could export to the entire world. But he didn't want to be in Galveston, and because of the storms and hurricanes, which we still have to this day. He wanted to be in a place that was a little bit more sheltered, a little more inland. But then he had the problem of, how do I get to the Gulf of Mexico? How do ships come to me if there's no ship channel or no way to get there? So he dug a ship channel from Port Arthur to the Gulf of Mexico and opened up that world. So it was shipping and rail that created it in 1998. Then by 1901, Spindletop came in, the Lucas Gusher in Beaumont, just about 15 miles north, and it ushered in the petrochemical age, which we all see here and in Troy now. And Port Arthur has been integral in that, but Port Arthur has also paid a price. We are the sacrifice. We are the sacrifice zone. And seeing pictures of this movie when I met you back in the summer at the, fall at COP27, made me question the fact that what's any different that's happening there than what's happening virtually in my backyard. There are flarings, there are releases, there's the smoke in the sky. I sent some of the pictures in. I don't know if they're able to show you on the display there, but what you see is very much similar. And what's even more similar is the fact that Port Arthur is showing the similar illnesses. You have people that have respiratory illnesses, that have cancers, and this is starting with young children. Matter of fact, we were told in 2010 that Port Arthur had over twice the state and national average for not just cancer, but heart, lung, and kidney disease. Now, this is in America. This is in a modern America, in a modern, fairly modern city. How can we treat people who are our citizens and neighbors and friends and relatives in the same fashion as being treated over there in a country that's not as developed? Well, it's all, as was said earlier, the colonial powers decided that whatever they wanted to do in order to get to those resources and to prosper and to become wealthy, that's what they did. And to do that means somebody had to be sacrificed. Somebody's life wasn't important enough to save or to cherish, like that father cherished his little Fatima, to be able to do something for her. And he couldn't. And there are many in Port Arthur that are like that, who can't do the things they want to for their children. My children, as well as myself, suffer from the exposure to these things. And that doesn't always mean that you're out there playing in it. You can be in your home, and as I did one night, woke up to go to the bathroom and smelled this odor. And I thought, well, maybe it's some, because two of my younger children still stay with me. I said maybe somebody's cooking something, burned or scorched something. Didn't pay it a lot of attention. Heck, I'm groggy and half sleepy. I just want to go do what I got to do and come back, go to sleep. Got up in the morning and started asking around and found out that no, it was something that was released in the dead of night. So part of the work I do with my organization is to talk about these things and show pictures of these flarings and ask questions. Because if we say nothing, then we become complicit in the very thing that is hurting and harming and killing people. And that's one of the things I try to tell, and I'm hopefully going to get that opportunity this year to talk to the Totals and the big companies and all of that, that what you're doing is genocide to the Port Arthur community, to BIPOC communities, to people of color, to people who, in the words of one of those big plant conglomerate managers, that they are the path of least resistance. They have very little means or ability or knowledge to be able to fight and push back, but someone has to do it. So after spending 38 years in the industry, I decided that was a fight I wanted to take on.
John, do people who work for the oil companies live in Port Arthur for the most part? Or how does that work? Because it's can be a complicated relationship, because here the oil companies have basically said, your livelihood depends on us, right? And so how are you going to bite the hand that feeds you in a way, right? But are the people working there willing to live in the same places with the same risks? I mean, how do they pull this off?
Well, it's a lot of ways you could say this, but I'm going to say it the way I've kind of practiced and and as I know it. When I grew up, kids I went to school with, my dad, I'm second generation petrochem, second generation union. And my daughter only recently got hired on after 2 years of going without a job, graduating with a degree in biology and a minor in chemistry. And she now works for one of those facilities as a lab chemist and tester. But the kids I grew up with either had a mom or dad that worked in one of the 3 plants we have there, Valero, Motiva, and Total, or they worked for a company that did business in the plant, or they worked for a company, did business with a company in the plant, or they worked for the county government, city government, and the 3 local hospitals. Well, now that's no more. Those 3 hospitals are now just one, and it's barely on life support. And those companies downsized. There was a time that you had the parking lots full of cars where each of them had more than 5,000 people apiece. There's now probably less than 5,000 people between the 3 of them because the industry downsized and changed to more computer-oriented mechanization. But Port Arthur, in my statement, doesn't work because despite over $80 billion of industrial investment, Port Arthur has some of the highest unemployment in the whole state of Texas. The only places that are higher are down in the valley where they don't have heavy industry that pays these good salaries and wages, averaging $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 a year. They have tourism, but they don't have some of the problems we have. And now they're beginning to see it because now the big oil companies want to come down there to export oil and gas in their neighborhoods and where they live. But Port Arthur doesn't work. And it's not because people don't want to work. On that little cellular device I have, there's about 20 resumes of people who have education that vary all the way from the 2-year associate's degree, which the plant says you have to have or they want you to have, all the way to master's degrees, who want to work in industry but can't even get an interview, or much less when they go get a call, they go and take the test so they can get in line for that. My daughter, when she was hired, was the only person of color in the entire group of 10. But Port Arthur people don't get those opportunities. And working in the plant, we would talk to people and ask them. It's 2 things the old guys used to tell you when you come to the job on the back of a truck and get off and go to your job assignment. And they greet you and shake your hand. And 2 things they wanted to know: who you know and where you live. Because without knowing someone in the plant to give a good word for you or vouch for you and say you're the kind of person they want, you don't get hired. It doesn't matter about your test scores or any of that. And then they wanted to know, well, of all the people they hired, how many of them live in Beaumont or in Port Arthur, as it were? So these companies don't hire, but yet they come up with these constantly escalating barriers of saying what you need to do to get a job. First, it was the 2-year associates, and people got them. I know a young man right now that got the 2-year associates, and he's working for a beer distributorship. So the promise of the jobs and all of that is really a joke, and it's not there. They don't hire people of color.
But this is like, we see this line all over the country, right? Like, it's always, oh, well, this industry is going to bring jobs. It's going to be prosperity. And it never happens. And
No,
it
it doesn't.
says, like, from Frackland in Pennsylvania to, North Dakota to where you are. And so how can we as journalists sort of help tell that story? It's a very hard story to tell,
Mm-hmm.
How do you tell the story of this sort of, this lie, right? And make it compelling, or how do you tell the story of, well, it doesn't have to be oil extraction, it can be something else. If I imagine you have another vision for your community.
Yes, I do. There has to be more than this. We've talked for years about diversifying. Since 1990, I served as an elected official, and in 2003, I finally got a seat on city council. And one of the things I've always advocated for was we have to diversify. We can't have all our eggs in the oil industry's basket, because when something happens to that industry, something happens to us. We have to be able to weather the good times and the bad. And, they keep selling this lie, but there are some glimmers of hope there. But as far as journalists, go, you have to get down into the root and heart of the matter. I'm going to be appearing before the House Natural Resources Committee next Tuesday. And one of the things we've already been told is that our Republican friends don't think that there's a problem with the discrepancy between what they say and what they do in terms of the impact to people of color versus people who look like themselves. But the statistics do not lie. And if you don't want to look at the statistics, or then talk to the people. Or as I like to tell them, as much as you hear me talk about this, don't take my word for it, and I say the same to all of you. Come to Port Arthur. Come and visit. Come and there. As a matter of fact, Owen, that's your next challenge. Since you've done this all down there, then come here and examine this. Let me take you on what I call a toxic tour. of all these facilities and see what they do. And hope I get a chance later to tell you how toxic it is. But come and see for yourself and talk to the people and let them tell you their stories. I just call them, I'm just a reteller of their stories. But talk to Etta Hebert, who is a 2-time cancer survivor, who's only recently found out now she's contracted another form of cancer, who lives less than 2 blocks from the southernmost fence line of the largest refinery in the country. Or talk to a retired school teacher, my classmate's mother, Annette Mitchell, and ask her about what she goes through fighting severe COPD, where she can't get out in her flower gardens and in her yard and tend to it anymore. Or ask Alcina Hardy, who has a 7-year-old grandson who, if he gets to playing a little too much, gets a little too rowdy, has to reach in his pocket and take out that nebulizer and give himself a couple of blasts to keep his lungs open. But you won't get to talk to Miss Carter, because for some of that very same pollution from a fire that smoldered and burned in my community for 102 days. And I've got pictures if you'd like to see it. The smoke made her so sick that she eventually succumbed from it 2 days before her daughter was to come and take her to the doctor. So those are just some of the stories, but get into the root and heart of it, dig deep, talk to the people, find out, check out the history. And it speaks for itself. They can play denialism all they want. The facts are what they are. And now that you're sitting in a seat in the political position to make a difference, why aren't you doing a damn thing about it? Or are you going to let us become like Iraq? That's the question in my mind.
I think I'd like to open the floor to questions, if it's okay with you all. And I'd like to have Lou Boileau, if you would like to ask a question, since Lou helped out. She's an MS student here, and she helped out with the panel. Did you want to ask something, or should I open? Do you have something?
Hello again. It's wonderful to have you all here. This is the first time, John, I'm seeing you in person, so I appreciate that, and thank you for all of your work. Well, I have so many questions, but one is about how it happens that companies continuously pass on responsibility. It seems like we're always trying to hold somebody accountable, and they're like, no, it's not us. It's this other person. It's this other subsidiary company. It's this other point of regulation that should be happening. And so as journalists, and of course collaborating with activists and researchers as well, essentially, what area of that decision making is most important for us to pinpoint in our journalism, and how you tackle the challenge of identifying a responsible body and a responsible party that can be held accountable. I know it's a complicated question, but.
Well, I mean, Jess, you handle that in your film, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we always try to think about what we want the impact to be when we do a film like this, because there's the telling of the story and raising the awareness, but after that, what are you actually hoping to achieve? And as you can see in the film, we go to the oil ministry and he says, oh, it's because there's too many cars on the road. And then we go to BP and they say, oh, that's so concerning, we'll look into it. And we've since been back to them again just last week, and they've given us another very, kind of saying that they are doing things but won't tell us what they've actually done. So I think we have to be as persistent after the journalism is done, and make sure that our broadcasters and papers have money to spend on impact. We are hoping that there will be a couple of legal cases that will emerge from this investigation, and that is looking at, that is using the laws that already exist in Iraq. As you can see from the film, there are laws and they are being broken by these Western oil companies. So what needs to happen is they need to be challenged. BP, for example, registered in the UK. It should be taken to court in the UK for breaking those laws. But it's a lot of work, and you have to kind of realize that the telling of the story, the finding the characters and building a narrative is one part, but you really have to follow up in order to not be defeated by the passing on the responsibility. And we've been doing the same with the Iraqi government, pushing them on what have they actually done, and keeping going back to them. So it's really challenging, but I think, using laws that already exist, because often they do exist, but they're just not enforced. So if you can work with law firms that have interest in environmental law, if you can work with government, we're trying to meet with people in DC and people like politicians in the UK to try to make them interested in this issue, and where there are gaps in the law, they should be working on new legislation. So yeah, those avenues are really important to follow up on.
Hold on a sec. Do you want to, John?
Yes, I will, briefly. What I think also, in line with what Jess said, you also have to hold the regulators and the people to make the rules accountable. None of this happens without the government's consent and approval. If they don't do it, if they don't say you can do it, they can't do it. And we've had to hold them accountable. I had the fortune 2 years ago to help get a bill passed, SB 900, to help eliminate some of the problems and put more regulations on tank regulations, above ground storage tanks for the oil and all. And so as a kind of a subject matter witness, I didn't come to speak for or against it. I came to speak for the fact, as I told those gentlemen and ladies, that you took an oath of office to protect Texans and Texas, to protect people in the land you love. And all we're asking is for you to make sure that what you do doesn't hurt and harm people and where they live. Make it better, make it safer, because they can do it, but it's all about the money. But how far are you willing to go for money? To hurt someone else, to have the statistics and see all of these things? So we have to go to the regulators and not necessarily always put new laws on the books, but make sure the ones that are on the books are enforced, and they're not. If we do things to strip the power away to help and protect people, we've got to make sure that the government of and by and for the people is actually working on behalf of the people.
My question is addressed to the documentarians. Is there among shareholders of BP, is there a green activist initiative? And my second question is addressed to the gentleman from Port Arthur. I'd like to hear your comments on the government's response to the tragedy in East Palestine. Thank you.
Yeah, I can address the question about BP's shareholders. I think there are definitely kind of ethical finance initiatives which are being pursued within BP, and there are kind of activist shareholders who want to see change. I think a couple of years ago, and one of the reasons why we were actually so interested to hold BP to account is that they had made a lot of noise about their net zero promises, and saying they wanted to go net zero completely by 2030. So that's something which we felt was important to hold to account and to ask questions about. But what we've seen more recently is that the oil companies, including BP, have been recording bumper record profits, all-time profits, and they're also reversing on some of their green promises that they were making just a couple of years ago. And I think they've actually been rewarded by shareholders overall for making that reversal, unfortunately. So their share prices have gone up as a result of abandoning those promises. And I think BP are a little bit more subtle about it, but you had someone, I think, quoted from Chevron when they recorded their record profits, just saying, well, oil and gas is what brings in the money. It is going to be continuing to be what brings in the money for the next 30 years at least. So until then, that every last drop. But I think, I know that's a very pessimistic sounding answer. I think there are people in finance who, want to change things, and that's definitely a group of people we really want to get this film in front of, so that they can hopefully start asking those hard questions and actually saying, can we, you know, stick to those green policies which, you know, are supposedly there on the books? It's kind of like a parallel with the laws that we're talking about that aren't being enforced in the same way those green policies aren't being followed.
I recall during the apartheid era in South Africa, there was pressure even here at Columbia University to basically dispose of any investments in, I don't remember the actual term for that.
Divest.
Disinvestment.
Divest.
Disinvestment?
Yeah.
Divest.
Divestment.
Or divestment,
Yeah,
yeah.
and at Columbia and among union wealth, we call these union investments, pension funds and so forth. And apparently it was effective, so I think a shareholder and large shareholders, prestigious shareholders, their activism should have some effect.
Yeah, I mean that's a really important point, because actually we all have probably some money. You know, everybody who has a pension has some money tied up in oil and gas. So there's definitely, you know, some power in that. And, you know, asking our university here, maybe, I don't know, probably has some.
Pretty dodgy about it.
Yeah,
To be quite honest, it's like
Yeah.
their language lets them get away with doing both, and so it's like no new investments. They keep their same investments, but it's a real struggle. However, you have to ask yourself if young people going to work either at BP or going to work at J.P. Morgan Chase or Citibank or, you know, any of the other hedge funds investing in this really want this world, this kind of world that these companies are creating, you know, and perpetuating. And so it'd be interesting to do stories about people who are leaving those businesses, you know, and companies because they don't want to participate in or feel complicit in it. Yeah.
There was another question
Oh,
on.
sorry.
There was a question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, you want to say
It was
anything on
yours.
that?
It was
for
yours
Okay.
about East Palestine.
Yeah, that's quite interesting you'd bring that up. Because just past Monday, working with some of the local media, I took them on what I call now the train toxic tour. Because some of this oil from Utah, the Oneida line, that's going to be this heavy, waxy, tarry crude, it's going to be coming to Southeast Texas. And then we've also got Keystone Pipeline, and since they can't pipeline it in, now they're going to send it by train and from other sources. And all of that will be coming through the heart of the city, passing within tens of feet of homes. I mean, there's those tracks next to one home on 15th Street, not far from me, are probably as close as that wall. Now, if one of those rail cars with 20-some-odd thousand gallons of highly flammable liquid in it happens to derail and puncture. If you remember when talking about in East Palestine, they had to evacuate everybody within a 1-mile radius. That's a lot of people in the heart of a city. And that's a 1-mile radius from that point, and if it's as big as that fire was, that can be anywhere. But these rail lines pass within tens of feet of people's homes and apartment complexes. If you go to KFDM Channel 6's website or the TV stations there in Port Arthur, in the area, you'll see that and see just how close it is. But one of the things that came out of that, as you're asking, was emergency managers wanted to say, oh, we do these studies, we've done this, we do have drills, and we have plans. But as one of the people they interviewed asked, well, I don't know what those plans are. Do I shelter in place, or do I evacuate? Where do I go? What do I do? I haven't responded yet, but part of my response to them is going to be, you know, yeah, in my time at the plant, 38 years, I was in emergency management too. And having a plan that nobody knows about is no plan at all. And when you plan to mitigate something after the fact. Our need, or what we need, is to not have the problem to begin with. Then there's no need for evacuation. There's no need to have people burned out of their houses and made sick and all this happen. Those things that are should not even be. So we have to, and one of the solutions is get out of petrochem. And we have to disinvest and diversify and get into something else. Because I didn't say it earlier, if you attack the money, that's what they love. You attack their ability to make money or to do this that's causing suffering, You make them change. They will fundamentally change when you change the narrative and the paradigm about them and their money. When you show this film, Owen, and when you guys come and see what's in Port Arthur, show them how people are suffering, how the promise is really a lie. I think it'll make a change. It'll shift public opinion, and that will cause them to change too.
Hi, my name's Jake. I'm an MS student here. Thank you all for being here. One of the most striking bits of what we just saw was the father reacting and saying, we know there's a problem, we want a solution. As filmmakers, how does that feel to have a camera up to a human being when they say that? And then is there something journalists, storytellers, in your opinion, can or should be doing to offer more in that situation? And then, John, maybe on the other side of this, are you, when journalists, people with access to medias are coming into your community, is it enough to just tell the story?
Yeah, you're right that feeling of kind of pointing at camera at someone when they are so hopeless and you're kind of telling them something they already know and they feel completely powerless. It was really hard, but we did feel like we needed to do something. So part of giving the results to people was what can we do to help them deal with this information. So one of the things that happens in the longer film is that we have a meeting between all of the families that had their test results, that had tests taken, with Professor Shukri leading the discussion. So somebody from the community who understands the subtleties of like how the authorities will react, how the oil companies deal with the communities, and for them to kind of brainstorm ways of trying to make the immediate situation a little bit better, whether that's having regular testing for their kids, whether it's helping families apply for compensation because they are entitled to it technically, or whether that's kind of organizing protest. So yeah, as journalists, we're not there to solve the issue, of course, but we did feel like we do have some skills that and some resources that can help people discuss between themselves solutions. Yeah.
And John, is there something that you would like journalists to do, or Jay?
Your question? Do differently or more
Well, you
or less?
you bring up a very good point. We should be more than tellers of stories, but we should also be seekers of truth and also finders of those solutions. Sometimes some of the problems they have, because of my background having served in government, I can give them some guidance and direction. But at the same time, there's work that I have to do, is to take those stories and elevate them to a broader audience like you all, and to make them take on a different life so that now you see the similarity. What really struck me most is watching that father, as you said earlier, and thinking about that if that were my son or daughter. Because yes, my oldest son, who's 35 now, he had kidney trouble. And there's no history on either side of his family tree. And he eventually had to have a kidney transplant. He was down to maybe 20% of total kidney function. But he was able to get a transplant. But what about the families or people who don't have that means? So we have to find solutions that go beyond ourselves and work for the type of social and environmental justice that's necessary to help them. Empathizing is wonderful, but empathy, like faith without works, is dead. You have to work on what you believe and invest yourself and give yourself to it. So I take it upon myself not to just be a teller of stories and as I like to say, but come and visit and see and talk to them yourself, but what am I doing to find solutions? And what am I doing to pursue that justice with these companies, to hold them accountable, to hold our elected officials accountable, and everybody in that supply chain, so to speak. That's what my job is as an advocate, not an activist, as an advocate for those people who sometimes can't be heard, is to elevate their voices and then to take action on their concerns and issues so that we can make their life and lives in Port Arthur better. So that statistic goes down. So that statistic in Iraq goes down. So that those governments change and people and corporations change their policies.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lena. I'm a doctoral student in epidemiology at the School of Public Health, and it's really, really great to see a clinician and epidemiologist working alongside activists and journalists to disseminate the findings of research, like kind of what the people in the documentary said. We know these things are bad, right? So how do we get this knowledge out to an audience who can do something about it? And so one thing that became glaringly obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic is that despite the fact that we have evidence, we're really bad at communicating it as like research scientists. And so it's really great to see this collaboration between journalists and research scientists. And so I would love to know, what can we do to get your attention? How do we work with you?
I mean, you've got to follow Professor Manuela's example. She is, extremely open and just, there was no, I'm sure we've asked just so many quite, stupid questions, really, ignorant questions, because we are complete outsiders and we don't have the kind of background in science that, that means we can bring knowledge to it. But we're, Manuela was completely open and receptive to our questions and ready to explain things. And I think sometimes it's about kind of getting, because we're sort of all in our own bubbles in some ways, and we have our own kind of language and ways of thinking about things, and sometimes it's just like a matter of just spending a lot of time. And I think that's one of the challenges for journalists, because quite often you're working to a deadline and you need the information fast. You want to just like have the soundbite or whatever, but actually, it takes a lot of time and thought to understand science and to be able to communicate it. And so I guess, just being as patient with us as possible is always really appreciated.
And also, Manuela's study was very striking. Like to read it as an outsider, it was obviously something that kind of spoke to what we were seeing in Iraq, and it was easy to kind of, even without a science background, to see how we could use the same tools in a different setting. So trying to get your work and studies out there, and you can always send things to journalists and see if they're interested. And it would be nice to see that. We kind of sorted it out because we found ourselves without any scientific basis, but it would be great to hear from scientists all the time.
Yeah, we're usually the ones sending the annoying emails, but we'd love to receive more of them.
But I also think it's just a matter of language, that I think it can be hard for journalists to go through a whole scientific study.
Yeah.
And there is the abstract, but for lots of journalists, it's just daunting. And so figure out what is the most compelling moment that you can sort of throw in your pitch to a journalist, and just put that up top, and then link the paper so that, we can kind of imagine the story behind the data. But I feel like I'm very hopeful for this collaboration and how you've worked with each other and helped amplify your research. And I think it could be something that we do more of going forward, or maybe our two schools do more of going forward. That would be great.
Absolutely, because all of our assignments are about writing papers that are going to be published in the most high impact journals that are going to get cited the most, but among a very niche area of people. But the public health is so applied that it needs to be disseminated to a broader audience. But that's would be really awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anahita, and I'm a student at the J School. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed watching both cuts of the film, and actually I have two questions as a result. I watched the longer cut and this one. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'll ask one at a time and then we'll see. My first question is about trying to know more about your process on ground. A few of us are aspiring filmmakers. We're in a documentary class right now. So could you tell us about your process of reaching Iraq, what happened there, and did you involve any local journalists? What did that process look like? Because we know that you're not from there. So there is some kind of justice to be done about people who work there, who know the context. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So like any of these types of projects, you do as much research as you can remotely from your desk, and that includes working and paying local journalists or local fixers or local producers. So that's what we did. We worked with a couple of different local journalists to try to, at the start, really just to try to find characters for the film and people who had stories that we felt best embodied what was happening on a larger scale. And then kind of in tandem with trying to develop relationships with people like Ali and Fatima's family, we were trying to see where the gaps in the investigative side of the story were. So, for example, if you've seen the longer cut, so you know that there was a gagging order from the Iraqi government telling doctors and officials that they're not allowed to admit about any link between pollution from the oil industry and health. So that was something that we had to find sources for and report on. Sometime we were really lucky with Ali. He was one of the first people that we found in our remote kind of recce work. But when on maybe our second trip to Iraq, we decided to go to the hospital, the children's hospital, and see whether there were people who lived, there were children with leukemia who lived near the oil fields. And that's how we met Fatima. So it's like you have a few different techniques of trying to tell the full story through people who are at different stages, and always trying to keep the investigative side going at the same time, which requires very different skills. It's kind of speaking to government officials who might tell you something off the record, and then if you find that, then you can't use what they said, but maybe you'll find it elsewhere. And so we relied a lot on an amazing team in Iraq as well. Our translator actually, who had never done journalism before, ended up being like an amazing, ended up doing amazing work with us and being amazing with the families. And it really relies on so much collaboration, especially when you're coming from the UK and coming to Iraq and saying we're going to tell this story. You really need to be sensitive to how people want it to be told and what really are the core issues.
Should I go ahead with my second question? It's about the difference between both the cuts. So you mentioned Ali, and we know that he plays a big role in the film. There seems to be a point in which there is a camera in his hand, and he's kind of just taking it around, and he's saying, this is where I work, this is what I do. And in this cut, he's almost giving like a voiceover. So I'm wondering about the ethics of that. Like, was it scripted and given to him? And how did you end up making that decision? And how does it feature in the larger discussion of what role a character should be playing,
It's a really, really good question. I think with Ali, we initially kind of gave him a camera and just said, show us what you can do, because he was really keen to do that. He's already a photographer and was kind of already a documentarian in his own right, documenting what was happening in Rumaila. He was taking photos, telling stories himself, and so we felt kind of giving him a camera that he could use was just kind of logical next step.
And also Rumaila is totally restricted, so we only managed to go there once ourselves, but the rest of the time the only way to film Ali was him filming himself.
Yeah, it was a way to access as well. But definitely there's an ethical question there in that, we were worried about his safety and, concerned that potentially it could endanger him to be, so prominent in the film. And it was, we had many discussions, hours of discussion with him and his father about the, what the ramifications could be and, how many people could watch this, and the fact that obviously the Iraqi government were going to be aware of him and what he's doing, and partly they're just incredibly brave. Obviously, they recognise the risk and they wanted to take it, but also kind of the decision to make him a bit more prominent in this shorter cut was because after the initial film came out, there wasn't a kind of negative reaction. In fact, the Iraqi government seemed to want to kind of make it seem as though they were behind it all along and, supportive of what we did. And so, giving Ali a more central role was definitely, a choice that we felt a bit more safe in making. But I think as to whether he was scripted, we definitely, as you can tell, we asked him to do a few links and things to make the film kind of work. But he was very much involved in kind of editing. We were showing him cuts and how he would look. So he kind of became a participant and a member of the team, I guess, as well. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. He's a subject come journalist. It's definitely blurring a line, but I think it's
so hard to condense an hour-long film which involves investigation into that 12-minute thing. So it does rely heavily on voiceover, and as you know, in the main film, there's no voiceover. So it's just it's really challenging. I think if you're doing an observational film that doesn't have any investigative element, it's much easier. But Ali kind of made those links, and we did that shorter cut because realistically, if you want more people to watch the film, their attention span is small. So we did that cut in order to hopefully reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much.
We're kind of at the end of the evening, so I just want to thank everyone for being here and for watching the film, and for John and for Jess and Owen and Manuela. So with thank.
Can I just ask you a quick question, please?
Sure.
Yes, I'd like to know what the relationship is between Big Oil, Ted Cruz, John Cronin, and even Beto O'Rourke.
I think that's for another night, maybe. Unless you want to answer, John.
I can answer that
Go
real
ahead.
quick. Beto ain't got nothing to do with the other three.
There you
That
go.
much I can say. As far as Cornyn and the others, well, I don't know about fled Cruz. He's not Ted, because when it got cold, he fled. So he's fled Cruz to me. Cornyn's kind of playing and lurking in the background, but they all have their hands in Big Oil's pockets. I can't directly prove it, but I know how they work and operate in Texas, and if you're at that level, you best believe that a lot of your money's going to come. And I'll close my comments. After that winter freeze from Winter Storm Uri, one of the main energy providers there, Kelsey Warren, who's head of Energy Transfer Partners, made, during that freeze, over $2.4 billion at the expense of all of Texas and the over 250-some Texans who died from it. 1 million of that 2.4 billion went into the coffers for the re-election effort of Governor Greg Abbott. I rest my case.
That's a good place to end. Thank you.